So this is the timber that I'm going to make the table out of. It's some beautiful old Oregon. Rough dimensions are about 4 inch by 1 inch. Now it is rough sawn, so obviously it's going to need to be dressed. I plan to do the whole thing on my table saw. So I've just drawn a rough section of what the jig will look like. Now this is looking at it from one end, and if you can imagine, one end will be completely enclosed with a piece of board covering that. So I want to keep about a 125mm distance both ways inside that jig, because I want to be able to mount the piece both vertically and horizontally. Vertically or this way to trim the edge, and horizontally to trim the face. We'll cut the two side pieces and the base piece. So the base piece, I'll cut it slightly oversized, 125, because what I want to do is once I glue this piece and this piece onto the base, I want to trim them both up together to be exactly 90 degrees. So I'll probably rip that about 135mm. The two side pieces, that's just 125mm plus the 32mm, which is 2 layers of MDF, is 157. So yeah, so we'll just rip the two side pieces and the base. Next I'm going to cut these two guide rails here on the side. They get fixed to the base, so I'm going to keep the distance of the size of those to a minimum, because I want to maximise the size of this centerpiece. That centerpiece is going to be taking all the clamping force when the piece of timber is clamped inside the jig. So yeah, to try and get that as wide as I can, first of all I'm going to try these runners at 15mm across that bottom dimension. So I've cut the two guide rails, and they're going to be mounted upside down on the base plate like that, with the centerpiece travelling up and down in between those two runners. So we'll get these mounted onto the base. Okay, so I've cut the centerpiece that's going to slide in between these two runners. The only issue I'm having at the moment, shouldn't be too much of an issue though, but because it's MDF, when you cut MDF it's quite rough, so the two edges are binding on each other. So what I've done is I've ran one strip of masking tape on one side, and that's going to be my clearance. So it's only a very small clearance, but what I'll do is I'll now mount this second rail using the runner as a spacer, and I'm not pressing that very hard against this because I don't want it to jam it in. So that can move there, so I just make a mark here, transfer that mark along the top, and I'll drill all the holes and screw this in. Okay, so that end piece is all glued up now, ready to be fixed down to this slider. And the way I'm going to do that is just take another piece of MDF. I've already had this one cut the size. Basically it's going to have two right angle braces behind it, so what I'm going to do with this piece is I'm just going to slice that down straight down the centre, and I'll get two 45-degree braces. So one will sit there, one will sit there. When you're working with MDF, it's important to use to drill pilot holes for screws, because timber does have a tendency to split. It's a good trick too on the face that's actually going to screw to your other piece, to countersink the holes on that side as well. Because what happens when you screw into a smaller hole, such as in there, it actually pulls a little bit of the timber out, and that way that little bit can fit inside that countersink, and it won't cause a gap between your two pieces. So as you can see, that bit is split. Even though I drilled a pilot hole, it's still split. So I'm going to have to think of something else. I'll probably have to use some solid timber for that. Yeah, so definitely one thing MDF isn't good for, and that's trying to drill into very small pieces. So I'll have to try something else. So I found a couple of pieces of scrap pine board. Yeah, we'll see how they go. They definitely shouldn't crack. And the other thing, what I didn't cut them down at 45. I'm just going to leave them square like that, so there's a bit more meat to them. Just another little trick. That corner that's going to line up with the corner of here of the jig, I just chamfered that at 45 so it doesn't foul in there. That just makes sure that both this surface and this surface will seat properly on there. So I've got the slider back inside the jig, and the idea is that's just going to slide back and forwards depending on the length of timber or the stock that you're trimming. To make that easily adjustable along the jig, I'm going to use a length of brooker rod, probably 10mm brooker rod, drill through the carriage here, right through, and 10mm T-nuts. I'll use two, one on either side, and that brooker rod will extend through and out through the end piece there. So it'll extend past the end, nuts and washers both sides to keep that fixed in place, with lock nuts as well. And yeah, just with a battery drill on the socket I can turn that, and that will bring the carriage backwards and forwards. To keep the stock in place in the jig, just going to run a row of screws up both sides of the end piece and across the top, probably about 4, and they're going to be screwed in from the other side, and they'll just be protruding past, so the points are protruding past. And we'll do the same on the carriage, just a row of screws along both sides and across the top, again with the points just protruding through, and they'll be used to hold the stock in place. to stop this hole in the end piece of the jig from getting ovalled out by the threaded rod spinning in there, I'm going to take that T-nut that I drilled out and put it in there, and that'll act as a bit of a guide. And this is the slider now with the 2 T-nuts installed and the threaded rod installed as well. So we'll just get this into the main part of the jig and see how it works. I'd originally cut out this piece here to go on the end. I wanted to give a little bit more stability to the end of the jig. Although it's quite sturdy, there's just a tiny little bit of flex there, so I just wanted to eliminate that. And originally I made this end piece here, but then I thought to myself, well, that has the potential to flex as well because of this missing piece in here. And I thought, well, there's no reason for me not to put a piece along here, because that won't hinder the movement of that carriage there. So I got rid of that piece and I made up this end piece here, which is just going to go on the end like that, and that carriage can still come all. I want that carriage to be able to come back as far as possible to get as much length as I can in this jig. So yeah, so that piece there, because it's completely connected all around, there's no flexing in that whatsoever, so that's just going to get screwed on the back there. Once that's screwed on the back there, I'm going to run the jig, this top face of the jig, through the saw and trim it off completely all the way around so it's the same height uniformly. So I'll get this end piece on first. So as this piece isn't crucial to the structure of the jig, it's more a little bit of insurance more than anything, I'm only going to put 2 screws in each side. I'm keeping them a fair distance away from the ends because, as you know, this MDF can split if you get too close to the end, so I will pre-drill that anyway. And also, if I ever want to take this carriage completely out for any reason, this won't be glued on, so those 6 screws will just hold it in place, and if I need to take the carriage out, I can just unscrew that. Okay, so the jig's basically ready now to go. I've got the screws in this end as well as that end to help hold the stock in place. I've just cut these little spaces here. They're just some scrap wood. They're going to help me get the piece of stock in the jig at the depth that I want, because I want to creep up on that. So basically, if I just sit that in there, first I'll wind that out a little bit. Put put that piece of stock in there like that, sitting on those spaces. So what I'll do now is I'll just pull that up. And that's in there really solid. So what we do now is run that through the table saw. On this table saw, the riving knife doesn't move up and down with the blade, it's fixed in position. Unfortunately, it bolts just to the body of the saw. So when you're doing a cut like this, that riving knife has to be taken out. So all I've done is I've set up like a temporary little stop here to the same distance. That distance from there to there is the same distance as the jig. So that hopefully will hold the jig against the fence down the end here. Well, there's the very first run of the jig, and that piece of Oregon looks beautiful. It's going to come up a treat. There's, you might not be able to see it on the camera, there's a tiny little step there, probably even less than half a millimetre. So to be honest, it would easily sand out, but I'm just imagining that could be just the blade is just a tiny bit off 90 degrees, so I'll just investigate that, have a look what's going on there. But yeah, for a very first run, I like it. Okay, so I've turned that piece of timber around in the jig, so the other side is out now. When I investigated why I had that slight lip in the middle, well, before I investigated, I thought to myself maybe it could be a combination of technique, because it's, like I said, it's the very first time I used the jig, and also the blade alignment. So the first thing I did was I checked the squareness on the blade. It was out probably just a fraction, but I've adjusted the square on the blade to my engineer's square, and I used my feeler gauges. Now the lowest point on this board now with the other side flat is that corner right there, so I just want to line the blade up with that, and we'll give it another run. Well, it looks like those couple little adjustments I made did the trick, because that board is perfectly flat now. Very, very nice. Tiny little burn mark there, that was my fault. I did stop, I felt myself stop halfway through the run, so that's okay. Like I said, the first time I've used the jig, a little bit of practice, get my technique right, that'll be great. The last thing I wanted to show you about the jig, which I almost forgot, was once you've milled the two faces, the idea is then to put the stock into the jig on its side on one of them flat faces, and using the jig to then mill off one edge, or you can do both edges, but milling off the edge by keeping that board flat in the jig. That edge hopefully should end up at 90 degrees to the face. I'll just use a couple of clamps lightly on this just to make sure it stays flat. They're just on there fairly lightly. Check the gap there, it's fairly much the same, and then I'll just tighten it up. So I've just milled the edge of that piece of stock. That's actually the second edge, and just having a quick look at that. That looks really good. It's really nice and straight, and it's got a nice edge on it. And if I put my square on it, hopefully you can see it. That's pretty close to square too.